5. We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, 0. We have solid rocket booster ignition and liftoff of Challenger and the 10th Space Shuttle flight.
The 3rd of February, 1984. The Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off at the Kennedy Space Center. Its mission: to test the new manned maneuvering unit and to deploy 2 Hughes HS-376 communication satellites, Westar 6 for Western Union and Palapa B2 for the government of Indonesia. Disastrously, due to a failure of their rocket motors, neither satellite reached its proper orbit. This is an account of individual and collective efforts to recover the satellites.
Well, it first occurred to me when, actually it occurred to Jerry Salvatore, who I was with at the time, when the orbit was first established on Westar 6. It was before we even had a problem with Palapa. The orbit established the fact that it was relatively low energy, and Jerry quickly calculated that there was enough control fuel in the satellite to bring it back down to a shuttle orbit, and that from that viewpoint, at least, it would be practical to recover that.
When Palapa was lost, I think everybody was crushed. And I think the thing I remember most vividly was Harold. And Harold talking about the spacecraft being in the proper orbit for recovery. And the only way I can describe Harold, and I think it was marvelous, was that when you have lemons, the best thing to do is try and make lemonade. I think Harold recognized that it had been a terrible shock to the morale of the company, and that he was interested in doing something to keep things going and to buoy up the morale. But I think that's really when the whole process started.
The first problem that stands in the way of the satellite recovery is a legal issue. No one is certain who actually owns the drifting satellites. Involved in the legal discussions are representatives from Western Union, Perumtel of Indonesia, a group of insurance underwriters from around the world, and Hughes Aircraft Company.
My first involvement was really advising the technical people that we could not give signals to the spacecraft, and that we could not embark upon a rescue mission without the cooperation of the owners. They were not really motivated to do anything to the spacecraft because they, of course, were concerned with what impact this might have on their insurance recoveries. The first legal issues had started being discussed really early on with respect to this idea of recovery is who had title to the spacecraft, what was the legal situation regarding satellites that were in the wrong orbit. Could there be analogy to maritime law, that these were abandoned like ships at sea, and that any entrepreneur could feel free to give signals to it, rescue efforts, what have you, and do anything to the spacecraft.
Even with the legal issues still in question, discussions about a satellite recovery continue.
I didn't have to hear very much to know that it would work technically. And there was obviously quite a head of steam that was building up at the excitement of doing this. It would clearly have to be a joint venture between NASA and Hughes. We to make the satellites safe and then to bring them down and rendezvous them with the shuttle. NASA then to actually bring them inside the shuttle and attach them to the fixtures we'd build.
Dr. Rosen talked to NASA, and as a matter of fact, in about a week and a half, they set up a meeting. It was a secret meeting at Houston. And I've been to Houston many times. This was an unusual meeting because when we pulled up to Building 1, which is the main building in Houston, there was a car waiting for us with two guys. And we never did get out of our car. They waved to us, and we followed them some circuitous route to the back of the base to a windowless building, which was secret. And we had a meeting to present the concept of recovery.
Only a small select group of NASA and Hughes personnel attend the first meeting. Unofficially and in secret, recovery has begun.
I think at that time, at that meeting, they chose the mission, the time when we would, everybody, they got out their little charts and chose a mission that we were going to shoot for to try to retrieve the satellites for that. And that was like in October. Everybody was going, my God, you know, we can't do that in October. Because it normally takes a couple of years to get ready for anything like this.
I guess, you know, we wanted to demonstrate a capability, and plus we wanted to do something. Here was the only significant failure that we had not, you know, in the commercial satellite field, and we didn't want to leave that failure just sitting there. We badly wanted to go out and do that, and to demonstrate recovery at the shuttle orbit.
In spite of the enthusiasm it is generating among NASA and Hughes engineers, recovery is still not openly embraced by Hughes management.
It seemed to us that we were putting our technical reputation on the line a second time, that if we won a little. If we lost an awful lot. So if we talk about the upside gain versus the downside risk, it was very heavily balanced in terms of downside risk. Secondly, it seemed like bad economics. If we were successful in recovering these two satellites and refurbishing them, we were essentially competing with our own sales here in the group. We thought hard about this in a policy matter and decided in favor of the national interest of the National Space Program as opposed to a narrow, short-term commercial interest. We felt that not only because we do business with NASA, but because we are citizens in the first instance, that it was our first obligation to support the National Space Program and to defer whatever narrow commercial interest there was, and to take the technical chance to go ahead and do the job.
It's going to cost us $10 million to bring these satellites back. It might fail. Who takes the risk of the failure? NASA wouldn't take the risk of the failure. Hughes was not prepared to take the risk of the failure because it was sort of thing beyond our control. And so the insurance group basically was a divided camp between those that said, let's not bother with it, and those that said, let's carry it and try to recover the satellite.
Well, we believed in the basic correctness of what we were doing. We knew that it was going to be important to have these satellites recovered for many reasons, and that eventually the legal and other problems would be solved.
To recover the satellites in the fall, the Apogee motors will have to be fired soon. Hughes can find no one to authorize the motor firings. The government of Indonesia, whose insurance underwriters are balking at payment for the loss of Palapa, is reluctant to authorize anything until its insurance claim is paid. Western Union, which has been paid in part, does not wish to compromise its claim against its underwriters by authorizing a motor firing. The underwriters, for their part, have no contract with Hughes and will authorize nothing. While it is still unclear if anyone will authorize the maneuvers or ultimately pay for the recovery, Hughes and NASA move forward with plans for capturing the errant satellites. In mid-March, a team from NASA visits El Segundo to work out details of the recovery.
So when that meeting was over with, I think the bottom line position was they were going to fly out, grab the bumper bracket. The bumper bracket would have a grapple fixture. The grapple fixture would hold the spacecraft. The astronauts would then raise the adapter up to the spacecraft, lock it on the place, and now the arm would lower the whole thing down. That was the basic approach. I think we found out at the PDR down at Johnson near the end of April that we were starting to have a serious problem with this bumper bracket. And so our whole question of the astronaut flying out and grabbing this bumper bracket was starting to be a concern.
To fly the MMU in a circular path, then to reach out and grab the bumper bracket on the edge of a spinning satellite is an enormous task. Hughes anticipates that each satellite can be slowed to 1/2 revolution per minute. If this slow spin rate cannot be achieved, the astronauts predict the MMU flying job will be impossible. On top of that, many fear the bumper bracket will simply snap off.
We put all this together and decided that we really needed to switch horses midstream. And as painful a decision as that was, because it really meant starting all over and abandoning our a month or two of work.
The bumper bracket approach is scrubbed. Gardner designs an alternative device for capturing the satellites. It is a long pole with spring-loaded fingers. When inserted into the nozzle of the rocket motor, the fingers would open like a large molly bolt, grabbing the satellite. Its name? The Stinger.
So now we came up with a major design change. This is where we went to the antenna bridge structure and to the Stinger approach. And in brief, it was simply the guy flies out to the spacecraft. He uses a Stinger to capture the AKM. He flies up the nozzle. The arm now comes out and grabs that Stinger. While the arm holds the Stinger, the guy applies the antenna bridge structure to the upper end. Now the arm goes up to that end and holds the spacecraft. Now you can get the Stinger out of the way to allow the adapter to come on. And now the arm can go ahead and lower it down as before.
Two things that couldn't be backed up were the orbital maneuvering and the adapter. But we knew that they were prepared to essentially horseback ride the satellite in if the Stinger didn't fit, and we knew that they had talked about being able to handle the spacecraft if if there was another interface problem like the A-frame.
One of the things that was always bothering me that if there was just the slightest bit of warpage in that ring on the satellite or on the adapter, that we wouldn't bring the satellites back because the adapter was a crucial piece of gear. It just had to work for the satellites to come back.
Still no agreements have been reached between Indonesia, Western Union, the underwriters, and the Hughes Aircraft Company that would allow Hughes to send signals to the two satellites. The apogee motors have still not been fired, and the satellites are moving farther apart.
Westar and Palapa started out in orbits that were 5 degrees apart. You can't really pick up satellites in orbits that are 5 degrees apart. But what's worse, Palapa, because it was slightly heavier than Westar, even given the same motor failure, Palapa wound up in a lower orbit than Westar, and so the orbits of the two satellites were diverging. And in fact, by May of '84, the orbits were some 18 degrees apart. Now, it's very difficult to move orbits, low Earth orbits, into the same plane. And one of the urgencies and requirements of the apogee modifier was that it would indeed get them moving towards each other. In addition, we would fire the motor, which would safe the so-called potential bomb, and we would also be able to remove the satellites out of the atmosphere so that if indeed it did not occur in November, that the satellites could be stored safely in an orbit something on the vicinity of 500 to 600 nautical miles, where we wouldn't have to be worried about any atmospheric effects, and ultimately bring them down later if need be.
It looked like the whole thing was going to come apart at that point in time. We had spent, $1.5 million at that, and that was not the critical fact. We learned an awful lot about the shuttle and shuttle interfaces, so as far as I was concerned, it was an exercise very worthwhile. We were reluctant to cut the thing off. We were reluctant to say, let's stop the work. So you sort of found Hughes and NASA somewhat reluctant being sucked into this thing a little deeper to keep a November launch potential, which was the one chance which NASA had to do it at this low cost. So we kept on supporting the thing, even though it was not clear that the Lloyds group could get their act together.
If Salvatore cannot fire both motors by the middle of May, he will have to wait until July, at which time the November recovery will be in jeopardy. Hughes intensifies its negotiations with Western Union and Paramtel of Indonesia, but no agreement is forthcoming. It is now the middle of May.
On Friday afternoon, the day before Salvatore was to fire the AKM rocket at about 5 o'clock California time, we got the agreement reached with Western Union. I contacted Jerry, and the successful firing took place that next morning on May 12th.
Jennifer Smolker now has only a few days to get an authorization from Indonesia to fire the apogee motor on Palapa. the negotiations go on day and night.
George Weishuttle and I spent, I would say, a good portion of the night on the phone from Jakarta on his end to my house here in town with last-minute negotiations, and it was really California time, about 3 or 4 in the morning, that he and I finally got the language hammered out.
And in fact, 45 minutes later, after I hung up that phone, we fired the motor in Indonesia. Both the motor firings were beautiful. They put them in exactly the right orbit.
So meanwhile, again, the word was just push, push, push. Get it done. Get as far as you can with it before they shut it off, so that it's almost, you know, more expensive to stop than it is to finish. So anyway, what I'm trying to get at there is the 1st of June came along with no decision, and the 7th of June, and the 15th of June, and so on. And the thing just kind of kept on going without ever, it faded, the decision date just kept fading into the background, thank God. We had a couple of scares, 2 or 3 times.
It was an interesting sort of phenomenon to watch the process of just not wanting to quit as being an effort that sort of drove Hughes on during this very grim period back there in July when we didn't see a clear path for the underwriters, and yet neither one of us wanted to say stop. NASA wanted to have the thing happen, Hughes wanted to have the thing happen, and we both wanted to go through. And if we were going to call it quit, NASA wanted to call it quit first, and Hughes would have stopped at that point in time. But Hughes didn't want to call it quit because Hughes doesn't like to quit on anything.
And I think on this one, it wasn't a matter of it couldn't be done. It was a matter of what are we going to do. And I think that was always the spirit of the organization.
It is now July. Hughes delivers 2 satellite mock-ups to NASA for astronaut training. Still, there are several unanswered questions regarding the safety of recovering satellites that are loaded with hydrazine propellant.
NASA was really worried about hydrazine freezing. And and by the way, just for understanding on this thing, if hydrazine freezes and it thaws and it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, for example, you can rupture the lines. The lines will eventually fatigue and rupture. So you can have hydrazine perhaps leaking out into the shuttle bay. Now, if you've got a spacecraft tied down in the shuttle bay and you've got hydrazine leaking out of it, and the astronauts are out there trying to capture the second spacecraft, and they get hydrazine on their suit, that in itself isn't so bad, but when they bring it back into the cockpit to take their suit off, they can kill everybody. I mean, hydrazine is just plain out deadly. You get some on you and it gets soaked into the skin and it's deadly. So NASA, obviously, rightly so, was worried about it, and we were too. It was our impression, though, that hydrazine doesn't freeze easily. And even if it froze once and thawed once, that was about all the freezing you were going to get, and it wasn't going to rupture any lines. But of course, that's one of those issues that you can never really prove.
Now it is August. Expenses are mounting at an accelerating rate. Hughes and NASA are still unable to make a contract with the underwriters to back the recovery mission. As Hughes invests more money in recovery, its negotiating position grows progressively weaker.
I finally looked up in August as I was about ready to leave for Washington, deal with Intelsat, and then leave for Aspen, Colorado on personal leave, and asked how much money we had spent and how much money more we were going to spend, and became genuinely alarmed that this thing simply wasn't converging. At the same time, I then turned to Jennifer Smoker and I told her very simply, I said, you tell those fancy lawyers for the underwriters if they can get out here in 3 days with a check and a contract, we'll sign it. Otherwise, we'll forget it. We'll stop the program and they can go get their own satellite. She did that, I think, with great relish.
I told them that this was the deal. And once having the firm support of your management, it's very easy to take a pretty firm line, and I knew Bud was very serious. And I told them that the ground rules were that the agreement had to be negotiated and executed by Tuesday afternoon, close of business, because I had to be on a plane to Aspen on Wednesday to get Bud's signature.
On Wednesday, August 15th, the contract for the recovery of Palapa is signed. Shortly thereafter, the contract to recover Westar is signed. The underwriters agreed to pay NASA and Hughes to do the job. Recovery is now an official program.
And then we got the contract signed, then of course all the financial risk was moved on the underwriters. And it was just the technical risk, could we do the job?
At the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, the astronauts continue their extensive training schedule.
During those last few months, we used the water tank here at Johnson Space Center for the in the payload bay procedural activities. We used an air-bearing floor here and a computer-type simulator to practice flying the MMU. We used the very high-fidelity MMU simulator up at Denver. We used the shuttle mission simulators here at Johnson Space Center to integrate with the Mission Control Center and the other 3 people on our crew that were in the cabin, so Joe and I could pretend that we were doing the spacewalk and they were in the cabin doing the coordination efforts. It turns out there is no one simulator here on the ground that is capable of end-to-end allowing us to practice train for a complete EVA. You can only do bits and pieces, and once you get up there is the only time that you ever put it all together and do it all at once in a full-up fashion.
Here we are, the 1st of September, and now we've gotten most of our new hardware in, and we're putting together our so-called revised hardware. And we're feeling very optimistic now. We've got a more complicated design. It's got a roller bearing, it's got springs, it's got some beefed up clamp shoes and some different shoes and so on, but everything seems to be falling into place, 1st September. We take these new drive screws out to Rodale Road, and the procedure was to run them in the machine, first of all, not on the adapter, but to run them in on the machine, which is a very controlled environment. Run them in 4 or 5 times, kind of get all the rough edges off the gears, and then put them into the adapter and run them in on the adapter. We can't really believe it. I mean, first of all, one freezes, and you think, well, okay, you got a bad drive screw, no sweat. And right after that, the second one freezes. I mean, freezes so bad you cannot pull them apart. They literally cold weld together. And it was like it was a kick in the head. We never really found the answer, quite frankly. It's not something you could point to. I mean, the bottom line is, yeah, you're exceeding the stress capability of the gears, but nobody really knew why. You haven't got time now at this point in time to go back and completely redesign the gears. People can come up with solutions, but if you want to make that October launch schedule, and by the way, for the first time, I think, there was a fear in my mind that we might not make that launch date.
And the thing that was so amazing is there was always an idea that when we had problems with the adapter and with the jack screws on the adapter, it was amazing how there was always another idea, and there were very few false steps.
NASA suggests to Juraco to try a Bray oil type lubrication.
All we know is that it works. We don't quite understand why brake oil all of a sudden works. Now, the drive screws were the ones that were damaged, and they also had the dry lube on them. So we just took wet oil and put on top of the dry lube. So we really had a mixture of lube. You know, we had the old dry lube, and then we had a few drops of this Bray oil, and we oiled the hell out of them. So lo and behold, for some reason, this Bray oil works. Now we said, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't be combining them. Maybe if we just use the Bray oil by itself, it's even better. We didn't know. Well, it turns out dry lube by itself doesn't work, and wet lube by itself doesn't work, but the combination works.
It is 1 hour before the truck will arrive to take the adapters to the airport. Juraco and his team put down their tools. It is the 20th of September, and the adapters are ready. They must be tested in the thermal vacuum chamber at Johnson Space Center. Now there will be no time for modifications. If there is a failure in the test chamber, the mission is over.
The last test on the adapters was to be done, and they had arrived in the 11th hour, been put into the vacuum chamber had been pumped down. I was to do the testing, and I had done a dry walkthrough in my spacesuit in the vacuum chamber the day before. The way these runs work is the astronaut, the willing but not too clever volunteer, in this case myself, is put in a spacesuit at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the subject stays in the spacesuit for 3.5 hours, just suspended there, breathing pure oxygen. That's because of a Benz avoidance protocol we go through. It's then noontime, and you still have the many hours of testing ahead of you. You've been in the spacesuit already for nearly 4 hours.
Here he is. He's got this huge suit on, this life support system. He's got, I think, some tools he's carrying along, cables and everything else that's attached to him. And of course, in a 1G field, the guy only weighs 110 pounds soaking wet anyway. He can't even lift this stuff, so you can't walk up this ramp.
I was about as upset at that point as I had ever been in the training, because it could mean such an emergency they'd have to repressurize the chamber, exposing all the gear to some damage. The test would not be completed. It would take several days to redo it, and the ramifications of it were really quite frightening. I was not sure we even had several days. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I got, and I realized that I could inch myself up the hill like an ancient person, taking tiny, tiny, tiny steps.
So here he is struggling, and you can tell he's panting. I mean, he's working hard at this. And we're all just kind of wringing our hands and shaking our heads saying, geez, I don't believe this. We're never going to get this thing to work in space. We can't even get in a doggone thermal vacuum chamber.
And over the course of the next 20 minutes, I was able to very, very gradually crawl up the hill like a slug. And fortunately got to the top and then was able to walk on into the chamber. I suspect it had taken me half an hour to 40 minutes to go those few feet. And I was nearly exhausted, and yet the whole test still had to be done. Well, I was so happy to be up the hill that I stood and rested for several minutes, and then began to think, well, let's see how the test goes. Turned out that the adapters worked so well that I could go right through the test, and got it finished in several hours, and could then go back down the hill, hanging on tightly because you tend to slide down the hill. And we got away with it. But that was a real sobering experience, and we came pretty close, I think in theory, to losing the mission at that point.
The pressure now shifts to Jerry Salvatore. Palapa and Westar must be lowered and precisely positioned for a shuttle pickup. The maneuvers that he must perform have never been done before.
The launch date was fixed, and what we did was go work a sequence for the 7th of November, which began on October 9th. And this was the, this is what I call the shuttle rendezvous doubleheader. It started on October 9th, and it didn't finish until November 14th when when Westar was picked up. We were sitting at 560 miles high, and in order to meet a recovery date on November 7th, we basically had 3 weeks to get both satellites down to like 195 miles. If we couldn't get them down to 195 miles, the shuttle would not be able to pick them up because they wouldn't be in the right place. So the first part of this sequence was the lowering. Now what made that difficult is these orbits were ranging from 92 to 105 minutes, and you'd have passes on the order of 5 to 12 minutes, and there was no computer on board that could fire the jets while you were in the blind. You had to literally acquire the satellite, find it, load a command, execute it, and repeat that for the guy behind, the follower, because the idea was to bring them down in tandem.
I guess everybody was a little concerned with all the maneuvers that had to be done, whether or not the satellites were they were going to bring those satellites down to the exact location we wanted and the exact station phasing between the two of them. And it's amazing, he got them there, he and his team got them there.
And it took literally a 24-hour effort for 3 weeks to make sure the satellites got low enough. There weren't only lowering maneuvers that were going on, we were also constantly pointing the satellites because the conditions for the firings were constantly changing. So we always had to turn the satellites, and turning the satellites, again with this limited visibility, is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you, again, because of the dual nature of it. And all along the way, we were ultimately trying to work the spin rate down in sequence, down to the low RPM for the pickup, the recovery.
November 7th, 1984. the crew of the Discovery take their positions and prepare to launch. Despite clear sunny conditions, upper atmospheric winds are too high. 20 minutes before liftoff, the launch is scrubbed. On the next day, they will try again.
We didn't have a lot of room for mistakes. We felt that there was a very good chance we could get at least one satellite back, and a lesser but still significant chance of getting two.
If we get one satellite, it's going to be spectacular. If we get two, it's going to be a miracle.
Someplace in my gut, I had an icy feeling that it was not going to work, but I couldn't put my finger on it. That something was going to go amiss, and that we were going to have to face up to something that we were not totally prepared for.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery and the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
You practice ascent launch so many times in the simulator that to me it's kind of a surprise. I've done it twice now when you actually feel the main engines light off and you know it's real engines underneath you. It's not the simulator giving you the simulated jiggle. And at that time, you know you're really going to go do it.
We were in the air, we had launched, we're going. At this point in time, it's kind of easy to say to yourself, hey, even if it doesn't work, we really gave it a shot. But of course you don't really mean that, because if it doesn't work, you're going to slit your throat right there on the spot or whatever. We're down at Johnson, you know, it's an all Hughes mission, which is a thrill in itself.
On flight day 2 of the mission, Anik D2, a Hughes HS-376 type satellite for Telesat of Canada, is deployed. On day 3, another Hughes satellite, a LESAT, is ejected like a frisbee from Discovery's payload bay. On day 4, Discovery begins to close in on Palapa.
I was typically nervous, as I always am during a flight, because you always wonder if you've thought of everything, and certainly we were that way with that. And the insurance people, of course, were new to this whole business, and they kept looking to us to know when they should sigh and relieve, you know, with relief, or should they be apprehensive.
Flight day 5. Everything is ready. Walker helps Allen and Gardner into their suits.
It came up to the period where Dave would put our helmets on, and from the minute your helmet goes on, of course, from then until you take it off hours later, you have scratched your nose for the last time, you have rubbed your ear for the last time, and you know you're about in, you're headed in for a long siege. You have to take a deep breath and go for it. David was about to put my helmet on, and I, for some reason, said, "Not yet, David, I am hungry. I've got to have something to eat." And he's, "For God's sakes, Joe," he says, "we're on time." I said, "I want a butter cookie." Geez, I'm packed to, "Okay, I'll get a butter cookie, I'll get a..." So he floats off, and see, when you put the suit on, you're hanging on the wall. Comes back muttering to himself with butter cookie, and he stuffs a butter cookie in my mouth. "Come on, chew it, get it down, here's the other one." So, and I felt better. I was, for some reason, very hungry. And butter cookies have a lot of good energy, a lot of sugar. I felt better. I said, "Okay, I'm ready. Let me wipe off the crumbs." Did do that, and he put the helmet on.
I felt very responsible for their safety, because I was the guy on the inside who had to check them out before they went outside, and to help them if they got in trouble, as insofar as help could be made available to them from the inside when they were outside.
We were not going to go out into the payload bay until Rick Houck, who was flying the orbiter, told us it was the time to go, that the satellite was at the proper position. But you know, you can't stand not taking a peek. So we opened up the hatch, and Joe looked out first and went out upside down so he could look up over the payload bay, and sure enough, there was the satellite, probably at that point still 1,000 feet over the payload bay, spinning nicely. And I could look down into his visor which is almost a mirror. If you look at it from the outside, it's sun reflective. And off his visor, see the satellite reflected into my own eyes.
When we first saw the spacecraft on television, I think that was very stirring for most of us. It was something that we just turned off a few hours before. And then to see Palapa there next to the shuttle, we'd known that something that we'd worked very hard for 9 months was probably going to be achieved.
And then your heart sinks. It's time to do the EVA. I couldn't wait till they got out of the airlock. That was just driving me crazy. It seemed like it took forever. And we were with them every step of the way.
It looked so surrealistic and artificial. It was hard to believe it was real. The sun glinted off of it, and it shone and sparkled and looked beautiful, just beautiful. And it also was turning on this invisible axle without the slightest hint of a wobble. From the moment I saw it, I did not see how we could miss getting it. I knew we were going to get that satellite. There was no way we couldn't get that satellite. The MMU flew fine. The satellite did not waver or wobble or quiver. It continued to spin. And the only thing that was alarming to me, as I turned around and pointed the stinger towards the nozzle end, I realized I had swung my face right around squarely into the sun. I could not see the satellite very well then because the sun was so overwhelmingly bright. All I could see was the silhouette, but at least the silhouette looked round, looked cylindrical, not elliptical. So I pretty much knew I was lined up with it, and I realized also that I was going towards it at what seemed like to be a good rate, but I couldn't see any detail of it at all. Couldn't even see the rocket nozzles or anything. The instant I got close enough to it, though, that it shadowed the sun, I could see it. And it was as big as a barn door, with the nozzle looking exactly like I had been trained, right square in front of me, and not more than 2 feet from the end of the stinger. I was right there. And I just kept sliding right in, and I do remember that the minute I came out of the sun, the lights on my helmet made it plenty clear to see, and to my surprise, I could see in the rocket nozzle itself, and almost as though I were looking in the volume, I could see shiny things inside the volume. Well, Stinger went right in, and by instinct almost, I pulled the handle that released the toggles, and I could see those fingers open up, shiny inside. And I know that the first thing the satellite felt was those fingers pulling from this side. I had not touched it anyplace. And I called out soft dock, as we did in training, and that's just what we did, soft dock.
I've got a soft dock.
And then the next step was to make the stinger shorter to get the hard dock. And I almost, by intuition, instinct, began to turn the handle on that. And like a gentle toy, the satellite just came right there and seemed to stop. And I said to Dale, I remember, Dale, the satellite stopped, or maybe I've spun up with it. He said, you've spun with it, Joe. I said, oh, and I realized I had. And within a few moments, I had a hard dock, and it was so easy and so natural. It was like shooting a fish in a barrel, no question. And we had it.
The pictures are beautiful. You know, the astronauts strap on their MMU and they go out there and so on, and they capture the spacecraft. It's fantastic. We actually capture the spacecraft. The place erupts down there. You know, everybody's shaking hands or passing out cigars. It's great. We got it. Believe me, I wasn't relaxed yet because, you know, we still had to get the adapter to work, and we had to get that antenna bridge structure on top of the front end of the spacecraft.
I expected something not to work. We all were ready for something not to work.
They're getting ready to put the antenna bridge structure on, and we lose communications for 20 minutes or whatever that turns out to be, maybe 30.
I could feel him using increasing force And he said, let me take, there's something, this insulation is keeping it. And he then said something like, there's metal here. Uh-oh. And then he said, I don't think this is going to work.
I think anyone who's worked with Dale realizes that there's not much point in asking him, are you sure? Because if Dale tells you it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit.
Dale Gardner comes back and says, Houston, we got a problem here. And I died. I just died. I could not believe it.
We couldn't afford an hour's worth of debate because those EVA suits have 6 hours worth of consumables in them, and at the end of 6 hours you got to come back in. And if we had had to come back in before that satellite had been tied down into the bay, our second and only other EVA would have had to been involved in tying that first one down, and we would have had to blown off the second satellite.
I remember talking to Lenny Nicholson. I said, hey, you got a backup? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, let's do it. And I knew that they had talked about backups to essentially to everything that could be backed up.
Meanwhile, Dale and Joe and I had pretty well come to the conclusion that we were going to have to go to an alternate plan, the closest of which, and we called it Plan B, but Plan B would have been any other plan than the one we were using.
Within minutes, a consensus is reached in mission control.
Okay, we copy Plan B and proceed.
Allen takes his position in the contingency foot restraint. Then Anna Fisher hands the satellite to him with the shuttle's arm.
Thereupon followed a struggle that lasted about an hour and a half. And the struggle was, first of all, Dale having to single-handedly put on the shower curtain cap, which he did. And that worked, and kind of as a precursor to putting on the large adapter. And he was going to have to wrestle the large adapter himself, which was something we need not have done had the normal plan worked. That could have been a two-person operation. He was also going to have to fit that adapter onto the satellite that was being supported by a very flexible universal joint, namely me.
Mission Control Houston, Joe Allen now qualifies as the first human in history to hold a 1,200-pound communications satellite over his head for one trip around the world.
He had to hold it for a very long time, and the position he had to hold it in required that he lean back and against the natural tendency of the suit to sort of force you forward. And so, and it was really heroic on his part. He makes very light of it in conversation, but I harassed him just constantly about not letting that thing bump into anything.
I think Dale worked for maybe 8 minutes or so trying to get the adapter to snap on. It did not go on. He clearly was becoming more and more concerned. And at about that point, David Walker said, check the clock position. He turned it about 20 degrees or 30 degrees, and within a few moments, he said to me, Joe, don't move. Don't even breathe. I think it's in the right position, but the soft docking arms had not snapped over. And he, without even breathing, reached individually for those arms and pushed them into a snap-over position, and then Velcroed them individually. He said, don't move, it is there. And then he said, I think it's soft-docked. And then I could feel him shaking. He says, it is on there. He then ran the 9 bolts, and all the while I was holding it. And at that point, we began to realize we were going to get that satellite because the adapter had fit. The working troops at Hughes can take enormous pride in knowing that all the rest of their lives, because that was a tolerance of about 1/10 of an inch over 36 inches, and that thing fit like a glove.
Gardner and Allen push Palapa against the V-guide in the orbiter payload bay.
All right, we got her.
I can remember saying, calling out the trunnions down in my V-guide, and almost instantly I could see the automatic finger come over, and Rick had been listening with bated breath, I'm sure, And the minute he heard that, boy, he threw the switches and over they came. And we had it.
As I watched them, what Gardner said to me the previous Friday about come hell or high water, they were going to bring those satellites back. As I watched with awe about that performance, all I could say was, all I could do was shed tears. It was awesome.
And I was fortunately was in America when they finally got it down into the adapter.
All the world like standing on the world's highest diving board. And you realize that if you fall off, of course you won't fall off, but your mind keeps saying, boy, if I fall from here, I've got a long way to go. And if I miss the payload bay, my gosh, I'm in real serious trouble.
Joe Allen in the process of tethering himself to the Westar satellite. He's also, his feet are locked into the manipulator foot restraint, which is now on the end of the robot arm.
When Allen takes hold of the satellite, Gardner uncouples the stinger. Fisher, ever so slowly, moves the satellite to the vertical position. Gardner raises the critical adapter into position. It fits perfectly. After 4 hours of EVA, Westar 6 is berthed. Discovery will soon regain communications with Mission Control and announce the news.
Rick had said, just as it was berthed, Dale, when we come AOS, tell the ground. And Dale said, no, no, sir. He said, together we said, that's the job of the captain of the salvage vessel. And Rick didn't say anything, but he did, in fact, when we came AOS, said, we've got 2 satellites safely berthed. And maybe in our imagination, but I think even possibly so, we could hear people shouting in Mission Control.
When Joe and Dale were inside the airlock and we were repressurizing it, the mission success was assured. I had the worst headache I've ever had in my entire life. To do all of this in 8 months' time, to me, is mind-boggling.
When I saw the spacecraft, I have to say it was really thrilling. One of the most memorable times in my life.
I was proud of NASA, I was proud to be an American, I was proud to be part of it. It was quite an experience.
I think the increased confidence that we should now have in our ability to handle these massive objects under the right conditions should go into improving our plans for doing that sort of thing with the space station.
It was exhilarating. That really is the only way to describe it. It was so fantastic to be there and see these efforts going on in space before the very eyes of the audience. I mean, everyone was captivated.
I knew this was going to happen in November. I just believed, call it a religious belief, faith, whatever. It didn't matter what was happening along the way.
I knew it was going to be a very complex and difficult mission, the most complex and difficult we'd ever had. But I was confident they could do it.
So I look upon it as being a conversion of a disaster, which is 2 losses, into a very positive sense of space as still an exciting place and a very interesting place to be.
All too often our achievements are not in the public eye. This was. We laid our neck on the line on national public television and succeeded. And so I think that was a plus. I think the other thing is that we redeemed the loss of February 1984 by bringing back 2 satellites that, while we were not strictly responsible for the failure of the McDonnell Douglas equipment, we had a hand in it. We contributed to the judgment to launch the second one.
A final and important lesson was that a small group of people from a relatively broad variety of disciplines worked extremely closely over an extended period with some amounts of disagreements and friction, clashes of personality, but in the end they had the same goals. And the goals were the recovery of the 2 spacecraft.
We have Discovery now rolling out, runway 15 at Kennedy Space Center. After a 2.5 million mile service call, the crew of 51A is home.
Westar.